in the state of Florida. Wrestler turned promoter Eddie Graham ran one of the most well-regulated territories in the history of territorial wrestling, taking tools of the trade from some of the all-time greats and applying them to the basics of professional wrestling, growing championship wrestling from Florida into something that people still revere to this very day. And now, the various talents that lived through the glory days are here to talk about Eddie Graham, ribs, and personal issues drawing money. These are their stories. I'm John Renton with my review, Tales from the Territories, Championship Wrestling from Florida, Bloodstains in the Everglades. And well, this was certainly quite fun, wasn't it? Let me know your thoughts on this show in the comments, please. It is really nice to have this panel discuss all these various things that happen in these particular territories. And other episodes that are coming up will certainly be interesting. Jim Crockett Promotions, Polynesian Pro Wrestling. It's going to certainly be interesting to see, the panels that they get together for these. But for this particular panel, talking about Eddie Graham and Championship Wrestling from Florida, there's Bob Roop, who certainly had a lot of great stories to tell. Steve Kern, a.k.a. people may remember him as one of the fabulous ones, also as Skinner, the Alligator Man. God, that was such a weird way to use him. I know he was near the tail end of his full-time run, but nevertheless, it was so. I remember thinking, this character isn't very good, but I remember him, but I was like, why are they making him an alligator man? I was 11 years old at the time. Kevin Sullivan, makes sense why he would be on this, because he meant a lot to Championship Wrestling from Florida, even after Eddie Graham's unfortunate suicide. Kevin Sullivan and his Army of Darkness meant a whole lot, and helped, keep Championship Wrestling from Florida afloat until its eventual sale to Jim Crockett Promotions, and I believe late 86, early 87, B. Brian Blair, and Gerald Briscoe. And Gerald Briscoe, him and Jack Briscoe, tremendous tag team. Gerald Briscoe meant a whole lot to Florida and Georgia and various other promotions. Seeing the old footage is really nice. Hearing Gordon Solie, and just Gordon Solie playing the straight man here, just even with all this bonkers shit happening, Gordon Solie, tremendous wrestling commentator. Sports-based, called it like a sport, made it legit. That's just what made Gordon Solie great. There are a lot of things that make Gordon Solie great. But even, near the end of his full-time run, like in the early days of the Ted Turner-owned WCW, he still managed to make, a lot of things seem legit, as Jim Herd was just torpedoing WCW into the dirt. Fuck Jim Herd, by the way. Jack Briscoe, how he got his start, what he meant to Eddie Graham, what he meant to wrestling. And Jack Briscoe, former NWA champion. I still love the story, and I wish they would have told it here, but because this was when him and Gerald went to New York, where they got into, the Northeast. I forget what it was snowing. He says, "I'm done." "Oh, you mean you're done after this?" "No, I'm done. As of this moment, I'm done." He took a flight home, and I think he might have wrestled in the South a little bit, but he was already pretty much out of the business by that point. He was like, "I don't want to deal with the snow." And I don't blame him one bit. But Eddie Graham, Mike Graham. It's really, really sad how Eddie and Mike ended their lives the same way. And I think like 24, 25 years apart. Eddie, I could sit here for 30, 40 minutes and talk about what Eddie Graham meant to professional wrestling, him and Dr. Jerry Graham, how they were a tremendous tag team. Drew in New York. Drew all over, but especially they were big in New York. The Graham brothers meant a lot to any company that was going to bring them in, but this is before even TV was widespread. News traveled fast of just the amount of the ability of these two, like Jerry Graham, how he could anger the fans to the point that they would want to riot. There's a famous story in New York about New York or New Jersey about causing riot. People set the seats on fire. They were literally that pissed off. And Mike Graham, of course, that I still love the famous quote that he said about Jeff Jarrett. He broke 6,000 guitars, never drew a dime. That was just great. Steve talks about his dad being a prisoner of war, twice, by the way. But the one from the time he was a prisoner of war in Vietnam is something that was brought up at an angle a little bit later. The black and white footage of Eddie Graham wrestling, a few clips of promos, the early 60s, early 70s stuff. Bill Watts, so many others came through. Dusty, so many talents came through Championship Wrestling from Florida because Eddie understood talent. That's the one thing he definitely understood. He, much like Jerry, he was an alcoholic. and Eddie was sober for a number of years, and that was brought up a little bit later. The training and almost torture, because Bob Roop was used as one of the guys, like he would use a sugar hole to teach people, oh, you think that there's something, fake about what I'm doing? Does this feel fake to you? And he would torture people. There's a famous clip on YouTube floating around of him just torturing people. You don't disrespect people that put their blood, sweat, and tears into wrestling, because that was certainly something. That was certainly something nuts. And then somebody was getting beat up. He's like, oh God, like, I'm not God, motherfucker. I'm Eddie Graham, and just beating the shit out of this guy. Because if you just got stretched a little bit, you might go, this is what was told on the panel, you might go to the bar and, oh yeah, whatever, I got stretched, but it's not legit. You have a broken wrist, or you have, torn muscles or something like that. People are going to be able to notice that, and you're not going to be able to hide that shit. Bob Roop was legit scary. I mean, I mean that with a certain amount of respect, but it's like the guy was legit as far as his abilities. And then the Hogan story, him being a fan, and a big guy, played in a band, met Gerald Briscoe and various others at a bar, was talking to him, wanted to get into wrestling, so they sent him in to train against Hiro Matsuda. And of course, famous story, Hiro Matsuda busts his ankle up and just, degrades him and stuff like that. Like, okay, you're a big muscle head that plays in a band, you don't want to do this. You may be a fan, you don't want to do this. Hogan, to his credit, kept calling, came back, and the rest is history. Boy, if Hogan had never come back, imagine what professional wrestling would have been. Would have been a little bit scary. I'm not saying that there aren't people that couldn't have done really good stuff. Hogan, for any of his faults now, in any of, not even revisionist history, but just looking with your eyes, you can see that Hogan not being in wrestling would have been catastrophic, because he helped take it really, really far with Vince McMahon's help, of course. But it's hard to ignore what Hogan meant to professional wrestling, and what he even still means looking back on it. Because he's a big goddamn deal as far as box office, as far as star power. He was legit. And to get his start in Championship Wrestling from Florida. And then more POW talk, and how that Eddie got him into wrestling because his dad was in, a prisoner of war, so Eddie took a liking to him. Steve and Mike had a friendship. And his first match was around the time, his first match or his first few matches were around the time that his dad got freed. And was brought back, and they had the whole thing where, okay, he hugs his dad, and his dad's like, okay, son, put me down. God, you look all different, because he was jacked up on a whole bunch of stuff. But nevertheless, it was emotional getting to be reunited with his dad. They had newspaper clippings, all that. It was really, really cool. And then Bob Roop, since he's a former serviceman, was like, let's turn this into an angle. Eddie was not there at the time. I don't remember if Eddie was still wrestling or what he was doing at the time. He might have been going to New York. Him and Vince McMahon Sr. always had a really, really good relationship. Did talent trades. Championship Wrestling from Florida was airing on New York television, because, again, Vince Sr. had a really healthy respect for Eddie Graham and vice versa. And it might have been just too personal, but Roop and Steve kept this going. And Roop could carry it off. He carried it off because it was like anybody that gets captured twice as a coward, this kind of stuff, and just really, really just nasty stuff. But it was legit because, it would have been legit even if Roop wasn't, but that little bit of extra incentive of him being a former serviceman was really, really good stuff. Roop was so hated, they carried this for 2 months. Roop was even had a guy point a gun at him in a parking lot. His girlfriend worked as a waitress on a military base, and they talked about how they were going to take something and they were going to blow up the house. That's how hated he was. And then we get away from that. We talk about Sullivan's Dark Army with Mark Lewin, the Purple Haze, Bob Roop, and Luna. Nancy did not get brought up. Obviously, it's probably a pretty smart thing. And then the old grocery store shopping and gimmick. And Eddie went for it. The thing is by the time that the Sullivan Dark Army stuff was going on, really, Eddie was starting to have his personal demons come back. They get into that here in a little bit. The feud with Dusty that because Dusty understood how, and respected Kevin Sullivan and vice versa. And they had Sullivan and Blackjack Mulligan fight, and they fought. This is for a house show, not even for TV. They're fighting, blah blah blah. Well, actually, they might have shot some stuff for TV, but they kept fighting. And they fought in the ring. They fought in the concession stand, the parking lot, halfway down, like half a mile down the street and everything. And then they were smart enough to wear the same tights. And Sullivan said because it's the only pair of tights he owned. They battle back next week, and it's the week-long fight, or the 1 week fight rather. And Dusty was smart when it came to ideas like that. And of course, Pat Patterson, the ring boy assaulter himself. No, I will not forget that at all. He was brought up about his mastery of ribs and also wanting to torture the young guys. If you know, you know. Listen to that Roddy Piper clip. Piper would have no reason to lie. Anyway, there was a thing where B. Brian Blair was like, Patterson passed by and they were like, hey, Blair, you should moon him. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to put you in the trunk, get to the toll booth, and then you're going to moon him. Oh, okay, I'll do that. And they're talking, but they got the music really loud. So Blair can't quite hear where they are. He says, okay, they pop the trunk, and he moons. And they're at a restaurant called Yeehaw Junction, I believe. And he's trying to get away and just panicking and everything, and also angry at the guys because he's just getting into wrestling and they're playing all the ribs on him. And I believe Gordon Soley was said, the patrons at Yeehaw Junction would like to thank Brian Blair for his appearance, which he said a lot better than I did. And how Eddie was a good man, did a lot of stuff for underprivileged youth. I wish I'd been able to dive a little bit more into that. I think this is one particular episode I would like to have seen fleshed out a little bit. There's only so much they can fit into an hour. He was street smart, but only had a 5th grade education, but he did drink. Now, he was sober for 13 years. Unfortunately, then there was something that got him back into drinking alcohol. And he was a pilot, but then they're flying. I think his girlfriend's there, Mike's there, Steve's there. I don't remember if anybody else is there. And Disney World's doing their closing fireworks display. And he's flying around that. Hey, Steve, this is just like your dad, isn't it? Like, God, Eddie. And then he lands at the airport, almost hits a big old jet airliner, but fortunately it was too far away. A big old jet airliner, and Eddie was gone. And has been gone since before today. Okay, that was terrible. The police were called, and Eddie played it up like, wait a second, I was fighting Killer Carl Cox, and wait, this isn't Tampa. No, or you're in Tampa. Oh, Eddie. Good old Eddie. And how Eddie basically glossed over how Eddie lost all the talent. And he had, I think it was real estate deals, went south, and the drinking had taken hold, and a whole bunch of stuff led to his suicide. It was late January of '85, and then unfortunately Mike Graham would also meet the same fate. 2010, I think. I want to say there was another son that ended the same way, which is just really, really unfortunate. But the legacy of Championship Wrestling for Florida lived on for a little bit as Florida Championship Wrestling developmental territory for WWE. Steve Kern helped run that. But yeah, Eddie Graham, as far as Championship Wrestling from Florida, that legacy will continue to live on. You can find various events. There are, I think, the three Battle of the Belts events they did in co-promotion with the NWA. Yes, they're all after Eddie passed away, but you could see some talent there. I did review those, but you can check those out if you'd like. But Eddie Graham meant a lot. I'm not going to say he's a perfect individual. Obviously, they talk about that here, but he left a hell of a goddamn legacy. And there were some good stories here. So let me know your thoughts in the comments. Like, share, subscribe, Twitter handle in the description. I'm John Retlin. I'll see you soon.